Hi everyone, my name is Daniel and I'm a pastor in training in CRC. First of all, I want to apologize because I know I'm supposed to cover the Wait What topic today on God doesn't change his mind. He doesn't need to. But instead, I will be finishing up on the book of Numbers. But I will still be touching on that topic once we get to chapters 22 to 24 on the story of Balaam, because that's where really the topic comes from. So let me start us off with Numbers. So last week we covered from Numbers 1 to 15, and today we're going to continue. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to give us broad understanding of what Numbers is about. And I've got this quote from Stephen Dempster. So he writes, within the overall structure of the book text, there is thus a hermeneutic that points to the failure of Israel to keep the Sinai covenant and to the virtual inevitability of exile on these terms. The kingdom of priests mediating creation blessing to the nations does not seem possible for this firstborn son. The sentence of exile that is passed on to the great Moses and one whose face shone with the glory of God seems to make this point in dramatic fashion. We're going to take a look at the later point soon, but what you want to see is that in the book of Numbers, as you read, as you go through, after the first 10 chapters, you get a sense that Israel is really getting worse. You get a sense of they can't save themselves, an inevitability that they will be exiled just by continuing to be who they are, and that this kingdom of priests will fail. So this is what you also see sort of in the structure I gave you last week. So over here you have the downward spiral that they've gone through. There are 3 cycles of rebellion, the old generation, they've gone down. And that just shows you how totally depraved they are, how sinful they are. As you read, they're just events after events of rebellion. Even with God's provision for them, and that's a very important point, even with God's provision, God's grace upon them, giving them the laws, forgiving them, they still continually heap up complaints and rebellion. Even in the second generation, as you can see, we'll see soon, the movement is towards downwards, and we'll see that much later. But what we see already since last week is that after the first 10 chapters of Numbers, you get the sense that things are just really going terrible. Dempster says for the start of Numbers that Numbers is pictured with the tribes surrounding God's tent. It's like an oasis in the wilderness. Can you picture that? So at the start, it's pretty good. It's in a desert, but so long as they're around God, God is like an oasis where the camps are being around him. And that's a pretty good image to think about, because that's essentially the first 10 chapters. God's presence is what brings blessings to the whole camp. And Israel at the same time is pictured as being grateful to God for dwelling with them. They offer sacrifices to him. Number 7, they were obedient to everything that he's asked for. And they celebrate the Passover as well as follow obediently the cloud. But once they leave Sinai, just 3 days later, things go downhill very quickly. People start complaining non-stop about almost everything, about hardships that God is pushing them through, the testing, which God has already told them he would do in Exodus. They complain about the manna, they complain about the leaders, and in the end, chapter 13 and 14, they complain about God bringing them into the promised land. They distrust God. Even though Caleb and Joshua try to convince them that they can trust God and God will bring them to it, but they completely refuse to trust God. They don't trust in the word. They trust in only themselves, and they fear men. And so because of that, they reject God and his promises, and they are kicked out of the promised land. They are sent to exile for 40 years to die. Here's a table of comparison between the parallel events of Exodus and Numbers, as you can see there. If we move through these 2 columns of text presented above, we observe that in each case, the positive scenario in Exodus. So Exodus is pretty bad, but there were some good points in Exodus. But what you see if you compare it for every good point in Exodus, you have something worse in Sinai. So Miriam sings God's praise in Exodus 15, but in Numbers, she joins her brother in rebelling against Moses. In Exodus 15, 22, 26, they recount God's gracious transformation of the bitter water into sweet, drinkable water, and God assures Israel that I am the Lord who heals you, Exodus 15, 26. Now, in Numbers, the image is just completely counted. In Numbers 11, 1-3, once they come out of Sinai, you have an image of the Lord's hot anger at the place called burning, because that's Taberah, right? The fire of the Lord burned against Israel. In Exodus, they complained, but they appreciated the manna and quail. They are gratefully received as divine gifts of food. But in Numbers, they start complaining about it. They complain about the monotony of the manna, and quail that God gives them kills them too. And in the end, they are buried in the graves of craving. Numbers 11, 33, 34. And in Exodus 18, when Jethro counsels Moses to appoint additional leaders to assist him, Moses doesn't realize that that's a problem, right? In Exodus, Moses didn't even know. But in Numbers, things were so bad that Moses is desperately crying out for help because the burdens are too heavy for him. In fact, he even begs God to put him to death at once. So, as you can see, after Sinai, things just are really bad. And also, finally, one more case is that in Exodus 17, 8-16, the Israelites had a victory over the Amalek. But in Numbers 14, 39-45, they were defeated thoroughly by them and the Canaanites. It's almost like after Sinai, things got worse. It's almost like after they've gotten a relationship with God and the knowledge, the law, they're now worse off. It's a little bit like Romans 7, where the law came in and sin came alive and I died. And that's what we also continually see in the book of Numbers. We got the sense of this, that everything that was given to them, every good gift that was given to them, they somehow managed to corrupt it. Chapters 1 to 10, we've talked about everything seemed to be fine, but right after that, they started complaining. In chapter 11, we saw just now, they complained about manna that God gave them. And in chapter 11 also, when God gave the 70 elders the Spirit so that they can prophesy and can also help out Moses, Miriam, later on in chapter 12, challenged Moses and asked whether he is the only unique mediator. Can't she and the others also hear from God's voice? In chapter 15, God gives them the law to punish on punishing high-handed sins. Just that's because of chapter 13 and 14, the rebellion. God gives them the law. Chapter 15, 13, but the person who does anything with a high hand, whether he is native or a sojourner, reviles the Lord, and the person shall be cut off from among his people, because he has despised the word of the Lord and has broken his commandment. That person shall be utterly cut off. His iniquity shall be on him. Now, just after this, we find that someone breaking that law in verse 32 to 36 on a Sabbath and being stoned to death. And in chapter 15 also, towards the end, when we see God graciously give them this instruction to make blue tassels, especially right after the person who broke the law on the Sabbath, God wants to remind them by giving them tassels to put on their garments, so that it will remind them that they are a kingdom of priests, they are to obey God's commandments. So in 15:39, and it shall be a tassel for you to look at, and remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes. So this is an allusion to Genesis 3, where Adam and Eve, or Eve especially, saw the fruit was good. So not to follow after your own heart or your own eyes, which you are inclined to whore after. So we see here again, Genesis 6, the problem is still there. Men's hearts are full of evil. So God gives them this tassel. So you shall remember and do all my commandments and be holy to the Lord. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. Now that's a good thing. We can see here constantly with every judgment that God gives them grace. But at the same time, we see the Israelites just continually abusing it. In chapter 16, most likely because of everybody having this tassel, reminding themselves they are priests, we have the Levites, and the Levites were just instituted in the book of Numbers. We have the Levites here, the leaders, starting a coup to go against Moses and Aaron, and especially Aaron's priesthood. They say, so in verse 3, they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron of chapter 16 and said to them, "You have gone too far, for all in the congregation are holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourself above the assembly of the Lord?" So here we see, now that they've got garments to remind them that they are king or priest, they're now going against the priesthood. What's wrong with their actions? We have to keep in mind that this is post-Genesis 3. After that, none of us can enter God's presence. The only one who can are those whom God has revealed himself to and allowed to come into his presence. To choose who can be his priests belong to God's prerogative. To choose how we worship him belong to God's prerogative. To insist that we can choose is to make the mistake of Genesis 3 again, to worship God with however we want. We saw in Numbers 1 and 2, even though the Israelites are holy as a nation, that there are still camp arrangements that they need to observe, that not everyone can approach God easily, not everyone can enter the tabernacle besides the priest. And so for them to really rebel against Moses and Aaron is to rebel against God and his order. So in verse 4 it says, when Moses heard it, he fell on his face, and he said to Korah and all his company, "In the morning the Lord will show who is his and who is holy, and will bring near to him. The one whom he chooses, he will bring near to him. Do this, take censers, Korah and all his company, put fire in them and put incense on them before the Lord tomorrow, and the man whom the Lord chooses shall be the holy one. You have gone too far, sons of Levi." So Moses asked them to do, if they think that they are holy, to do what priests should do. It's very interesting that Moses asked him that and then they're okay with it, because this is the same thing that Nadab and Abihu did, and that God burned them because of. Here he rebukes the sons of Levi, verse 8. And Moses said to Korah, "Hear now, you sons of Levi, is it too small a thing for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the congregation of Israel to bring you near to himself, to do service in the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them, that he has brought you near him and all your brothers and sons of Levi with you, and you would seek the priesthood too?" The point here is that God has already privileged them to bring them into his presence as Levites to serve him, and yet they're not satisfied. True holiness is not really about being a priest. True holiness, as we saw in chapter 15, towards the end, is really about obeying God, serving him faithfully. So Korah gets it wrong when they're trying to be priests without understanding what true service is, what true holiness is. And it seems like it takes a big effort for the Israelites to really finally get that it is God who chooses whom he wants to be priests, and that not everyone can access God. It takes God later on to send judgment by earthquake to swallow up Korah and the gang, and also divine fire to kill 250 of the leaders there. And even God turned the censers that was made holy because of the sacrifice, made that into a covering for the altar. But even that, so that's grace shown, but even that they still don't appreciate. And they still in the end up wanting to kill Moses and Aaron. So in 1641, the next day, just the day after God sent the earthquake to swallow up Korah, Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron and says, "You have killed the people of the Lord." Something's wrong here. They don't seem to be able to understand that Korah and the company were the wrong ones. They are not people of the Lord, they are enemies of God. But the congregation does not care about God. They didn't care about God's holiness, and they didn't understand sin. So they assembled against Moses and Aaron, and for Moses and Aaron, they turned towards the tent of meeting. And God came, and Moses and Aaron came to the front of the meeting, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Get away from the midst of this congregation, that I may consume them in a moment." And they fell on their faces, and Moses said to Aaron, "Take your censer." So here you see that despite all the evil that's being done to Moses, Moses here is a meek and good mediator. He still does this ultimately because he cares for God's glory. Remember Numbers 14, where he intervenes and he asks God not to destroy the Israelites because that will affect his reputation amongst the nations. I don't think here Moses is doing it because necessarily he thinks highly of them, but because he loves God's reputation and he loves Israel as a whole, Israel in God's plan. And so he calls Aaron to go and make atonement for them with the censer. And now this time for Aaron, who's the true priest, to take the censer, his sacrifice is accepted by God, and he therefore is shown to be the priest that God accepts. But the cost of that, 14,700 people died. But even then, they were not satisfied. They were not happy until God had to use Aaron's staff to make it sprout and bear almonds to show, almonds are white to show Aaron's holiness, his set apartness before they get the point. That only Aaron's household is accepted as priests to do priestly duties. And at that point, they'll ask, "Oh no, what's going to happen to us?" And so this is where chapters 18 to 19 come in. Chapters 18 and 19 both reaffirm the role of the priests. Chapter 18 reaffirms again the role of the priests and Levites. Chapter 18 begins with the words, "The Lord said to Aaron." Now this is interesting because most of the time when God speaks, he speaks to Moses and then uses Moses to speak to Aaron. But when God speaks here to Aaron, it shows. This is a sign that the priesthood, Aaron, is special to God. That they have a special relationship with God. And this and the other events in the preceding chapters show and confirm that Aaron's status of a high priest, a status that may have come under question by the people. So God's words to Aaron stress the responsibility, so in chapter 18, of the inner circle of Aaronic priests to be on the front lines of bearing the sin of the community. The priests are to protect the community from drawing near, so making it clear again what their duty is to the holy vessels and furnishings of the inner sanctuary. And this time, failure to do so will result in not just the death of those who approach him, but as well as the death of the priests who failed to guard the altar. So verse 3 of chapter 18, "They shall keep guard over you and over the whole tent, but shall not come near to the vessels of the sanctuary or to the altar, lest they and you die." And the Levites, they're supposed to form a second line of protection around the tent of meeting. And together with the priests, they're supposed to guard anyone, to guard God's holiness, to prevent anyone from coming into the tent. And this service that the priests and Levites offer to the community is a gift from God designed for the people. Verse 6, "And behold, I have taken your brothers, the Levites, from among the people of Israel. They are a gift to you, given to the Lord to do service of the tent of meeting. And you and your sons and you shall guard your priesthood for all that concerns the altar and that is within the veil, and you shall serve. I give your priesthood as a gift to the people, and any outsider who comes near shall be put to death." The rest of chapter 18 talks about the tithe and support that the people are to give to the priests and Levites. And so with this system implemented, we see that because the priests and Levites are supposed to serve the people are supposed to give them money, give them support. Chapter 18, 12 to 14, "All the best of the oil and all the best of the wine, and all the grain, first fruits of what they give to the Lord, I give to you." This is to the priests. "The first ripe fruits of all that is in the land, which they bring to the Lord, shall be yours. Everyone who is clean in your house may eat it." Now notice how also this presupposes, again, entry into the promised land, the best wine and best grain. So even in the law that God gave after the terrible rebellion, God is looking forward, God is showing grace, God is promising them that He will bring them into the promised land. So just before this, you might be thinking they will never be able to enter. But here we see hope. We see God's promise. The primary rationale for the priest receiving the offering made to God is in Numbers 18:20. God says to Aaron, "You shall have no allotment in their land, nor shall you have any share among them. I am your share and your possession among the Israelites." So here the priests are to be supported because they have no property. But at the same time, the way the priests live is also to be a constant reminder to how all Israelites are to live. They are all supposed to live in dependence on God, dependence on God's blessings. This was the purpose of God sending them to the wilderness to be tested so that they learn that all things come from God and they ought to listen to God's voice more than anything. The rest of Numbers 18 continues to show, talks about the Levites and how they should also receive support, and also how they themselves should tithe to the priests to show that they are under the priests. In chapter 20, so after the laws, or chapter 19, there's another section on the law, on how God provides for the common person to be able to cleanse themselves from uncleanness in a faster way. And that's because the death toll has increased and uncleanness has spread quite seriously. And so God provides through the priests, again, another way to atone for, to remove the uncleanness. So in chapter 20, 21, we're moving on to the third cycle of rebellion. And it is here, chapter 20, verse 1, we're finally at the end. We're at the end of the 40 years in the wilderness. It says here, "And the people of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month," and that marks, later on you'll see chapter 33, the end of the 40th year. "And the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there." So Miriam's death also foreshadows the death of the old generation. This is the year when they are supposed to come out. This is also the year where everyone else who belongs to the old generation, as promised to God, will and should die. And what we see here, very tragically, at the start of the third cycle, is immediately the fall of God's leaders, which is Moses and Aaron. Verse 2. "Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and Aaron, And the people quarreled with Moses and said, 'Would that we had perished from our brothers, perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into the wilderness, that we should die here, both we and the cattle? Why have you made us come out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink.' Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, 'Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water, so you shall bring water out of the rock from them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle.' But take note of this, this is where things go wrong. And Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, 'Hear now, rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?' And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly. And the congregation drank in their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'Because you did not believe me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them.'" Now, how do we understand what's wrong with what they did? The key to the problem is to be found by comparing what God told Moses to do and what Moses actually did. So if you take a look at verse 8 and 10, if you compare it, you will see the difference. Moses didn't obey God perfectly when he should. Moses was instructed to take the rod, assemble the congregation, and speak to the rock. But instead, he took the rock, gathered the assembly, spoke to them angrily instead of the rock, and then struck the rock. Now, this is quite a sad case, because to our eyes it looks like a very small thing, and the people really were rebellious. But to God it's not. Moses' failure to carry out the Lord's instructions precisely was as much an act of unbelief, as well as also a failure to sanctify God. This problem was also the same problem in Leviticus 10:3, when Nadab and Abihu, they didn't sanctify God in front of everyone. So Moses also failed to do so. There's also the other bit where the rock also symbolized God's presence. This is all the way back to Exodus 17:6, where God told, it was the same scenario where it was there was not enough water, there was no water. So God told Moses to speak to the rock, but at that time he said also that God's presence will be at the rock. So what's happening here is a similar thing, but Moses, because he struck the rock, could also show his impatience and also disrespect for God's presence. This is the reason why Paul later in 1 Corinthians 10 can say that Christ was at the rock, because God himself said that his presence will be at the rock. So Moses failed to sanctify God. He did not acknowledge publicly God's purity and God's unapproachability. And when unholy men approach God, he shows himself holy by immediate or delayed judgment. That's how God shows himself holy. Whereas Aaron's sons died on the spot for offering incense that was not commanded, Moses and Aaron received a lighter sentence, but they would not be allowed to lead the people into the promised land. So the rest of the chapter, of chapter 20 and 21, continues to show there's some improvement. Well, after this, right after Moses' failure, there was a rejection to pass through Edom. And some scholars say that the problem with that was because you notice that prior to this and after this, Moses would always consult God when he moves. But at this point, he doesn't consult God. Probably it's because of his grief that he was rejected. That's one option. I'm personally not too sure, because Deuteronomy says that he did ask God. I take it that Edom's rejection of Israel now is their way of cutting ties with Israel. There's a long history back where Esau and Jacob, where Esau asked Jacob to go back with him, but Jacob didn't, and now Esau's probably doing the same thing back to Jacob. But what happens here is a breaking of relationship, and eventually later on in Balaam's prophecy, Edom will be judged because he's no longer Genesis 12:3 blessing Israel, and therefore will not be blessed. So those who curse Israel will be cursed. So after this, there's one event that showed a slight improvement. Chapter 21 verse 1. That's the first positive event after all the series of negatives, and that happened at Hormah. So when the Canaanite, verse 1, the king of Arad, who lived in Egypt, heard that Israel was coming by the way of Atharim, he fought against Israel and took some of them captive. And Israel vowed a vow to the Lord and said, "If you will indeed give this people into my hand, then I will devote their cities to destruction." And the Lord heeded the voice of Israel and gave over the Canaanites, and they devoted them and their cities to destruction. So the name of the place was called Hormah, which means destruction. Now take note, this is the same place where Israel was chased to when they disobeyed God in chapter 14, 39 to 45. So this was when God told them that he would not bring them into the promised land. Israel said, "We're sorry." Then they tried to go into the promised land by force, and they were chased out. So what's happening in 21 is very significant. After 40 years, if they this obedience and this success showed them what would have happened if they actually obeyed God. They would have actually destroyed their cities and devoted destruction. But because they didn't, they were sent to the promised land. But this is what would have happened if they did. So here's a reversal. Things are starting to look a little bit better. But of course, right after this, you have an incident that's worth mentioning because our Lord Jesus Christ mentioned this event, but that's them grumbling again and then God sending fiery snakes. So verse 4, from Mount Hor they set out by the way to the Red Sea to go around the land of Edom, and the people became impatient on the way. And the people spoke against God and Moses, why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. Then the Lord sent fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people so that many of the Israelites died. And people came to Moses and said, we have sinned, for we have spoken against the Lord and against you. Pray to the Lord that he may take away the serpents from us. So Moses prayed for the people, and the Lord said to Moses, make a copper, so this is a bad translation, not fiery, but copper, the color is important, serpent, and set it on the pole, and everyone who is bitten, when he sees it, shall live. Now Jesus quotes this example in John 3, and it's worth asking, why is he quoting it, what does this mean? And why, in this case, did God choose to use a copper serpent to erect it so that they can see it and live? Now copper is red in color, or is close to red. And so serpent is an unclean animal. So what's going on here is God is putting this up and saying, so red obviously means blood. So there's the idea of atonement here, but there's also an unclean animals. The idea is that if they look up, and there is a reason why they need to look up, because that's an act of faith. They need to acknowledge that they are the unclean person, that they should be up there. And it should be them and not the snake there. By that act of faith, the snake shedding the blood for them, that they can be saved. And that is how I think how our Lord Jesus Christ took that to refer to himself. He referred, of course, to his death and resurrection, just as the snake was lifted up. And so that's taken from here. The next part I want to focus on is on Balaam Story. And Balaam Story is really an important story, and to some extent, if you remember the structure I gave you, it is the center of the book. It talks about God's unswerving faithfulness to bless his elect people despite Israel's utter sinfulness, as we can see throughout the whole book of Numbers so far. So despite Israel continue to rebel against God, their determination to go against God, what we see here gives us hope. What we see here is that God has not changed his mind about Israel. God is determined to bring his people into his land and bless them without compromising, of course, justice. The question is how. So Balaam's story is about that. Balaam's story is a little bit like a story of Job, where God and Satan are talking in heaven, and Job is not sure of what's going on. And so this is what is happening to Israel without Israel's knowledge. Israel is down there moving towards Moab, and this is Balak trying to get Balaam, trying to hire a powerful prophet called Balaam to curse Israel. So this is a story of how God protects Israel, even from outside forces, even from enemies, without Israel's knowledge, because God is determined to do so. So we can't go through the whole story, but if you take a look at the table, essentially sums up the events, and you'll find a very interesting thing, which there are sets of trees going around. It takes 3 episodes of encounter with God for Balaam to submit to God. It takes 3 episodes of him dealing with the donkey to realize his own blindness and danger of rebelling against God. And finally, it takes 3 episodes of blessings to finally see clearly God's determination to bless Israel. And then he adds on the final 4th blessing, because he's seen clearly, and the final 4th blessing is talking about Israel's distant future. So this story talks about how God will surely bless his people, not because his people are faithful, but because he is faithful, because he doesn't change his mind. He is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. So this also has to do with the wait what topic, which I didn't manage to talk about, but the point there is God doesn't change his mind. You see that here. Even despite Israel's failure and all, God says here he doesn't change his mind. So if you take a look at the oracles. The first one in verse 7 of chapter 23. This is the first oracle that he gave. And Balaam took up his discourse and said, "An Aram Balak," so that's Balak, "has brought me the king of Moab from the eastern mountains. Come, curse Jacob for me, and come, denounce Israel." But how can I curse whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce whom the Lord has not denounced? For from the top of the crags I see him, so this is the mountain, and from the hills I behold him. Behold, I see a people dwelling alone, and not counting itself among nations. So here, this is a special nation. That's what it's saying here. A nation that is distinct and it's holy for God, and who will bless the whole world. Verse 10, who can count the dust of Jacob? This is referring to Genesis 15, or number of the fourth part of Israel. Let me die the death of the upright, and let my end be like his. So he's saying, let me be with them. I'd rather die and be with them. And of course, Balak's not happy. He brings him to another place, as if bringing to another place would change God's mind. Asks him to curse Israel again. But here, verse 18, rise, Balak, and hear. Give ear to me, O son of Zippor. And this is the key verse, verse 19. God is not man that he should lie. Now already, if you have read Numbers, you would know one of the clearest reference here for men is Israel. Israel is a stubborn and evil nation. The people are fickle-minded. The people do not worship God, or they flip-flop. They keep changing their minds. But God says, I'm not man that I should lie, or a son of man that I should change my mind. Has he said and will not do it? Or has he spoken and will he not fulfill it? So here we can see that God doesn't change his mind because he is consistent with what he has promised. There are two things here. One is God is faithful to finish, to fulfill his promises. Number two, he already has a plan. God doesn't need to change his mind because he already has a plan, and what he says he will do. And what he says he has been doing since creation and since Genesis 12. Behold, I receive a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot revoke it. He has not beheld misfortune in Jacob, nor has he seen trouble in Israel. Now this is very interesting, verse 21. Another translation is, he has not beheld sin in Jacob. He has not seen trouble in Israel. And so this is not what's happening in Israel right now. Israel is a mess. Israel is full of trouble, misfortune. So what is going on here is that God is looking to the future. That this will be a future for Israel, that there will be a time where there will be no misfortune or sin. There will be no trouble there. Despite all that's happening, this is what God promises. And the Lord God is with them, and the shout of a king is among them. So here we see that the king is divine. Later in the next two parables, you will see this idea of a king being a human king. So already here, in Balaam's prophecy, looks forward to the coming of the incarnate Son. Verse 21 talks about a divine king who will be the king of Israel. Later on in third and fourth prophecy, you see a human king being the king. God brings them out of Egypt, verse 22, and is for them like the horns of the wild ox. For there is no enchantment against Jacob, no divination against Israel. So he's talking about what Balak is trying to do to him. He's trying to hire Balaam to curse him. There's no divination against Israel because God is their king. And now it shall be said of Jacob and Israel, what has God wrought? Behold, a people, a lioness, it rises up. This is from Genesis 49. The promise, the blessing that Jacob gave to Judah. So a lioness, it rises up, and the lion, it lifts up. So despite all that's happening with Israel, the sin that is committed, God is still committed to fulfill the Abrahamic promise that he has made with Abraham. Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17. It does not lie down until he has devoured the prey. So here it talks about conquering his enemies and rule, subdue this world. Numbers 22 to 24 is really the pinnacle of the book of Numbers because it shows clearly God's grace and faithfulness despite Israel's wickedness. It shows God is in control, and it shows that God is actively fulfilling the Abrahamic covenant. And it's worth reading through the 4 oracles and looking at it, but I'm going to pick up a few key things you should be picking up from if you look at it carefully, compare them. These 4 oracles display a meaningful progression in its use of metaphors and images, especially around the topic of kingship, both human and divine. So there's a theme of rising and falling, where Israel will rise and the enemies will fall. That's in these 4 oracles. The first oracle makes no mention of a king, only Israel in general as a people. The prophet Balaam begins in the first oracle as the one who is high up on a hill, looking down on Israel. Verse 9 it says, "From the top of the crags I see him." But then in the second oracle, it is the people of Israel who are rising up like a lioness and rousing itself like a lion, 23, 24. "Behold, the people, a lioness rises up, and as a lion it lifts up itself. It does not lie down until it's devoured the prey and drunk the blood of slain." And kingship is mentioned for the first time in the second oracle. And I mentioned that already, it's a divine kingship. Now Balaam had risen and stood high above Israel in the first poem, but in the third oracle, Balaam falls down before the vision of the Almighty. The image of God as like the horns of a wild ox is repeated and developed in more detail. God shall devour the nations that are his foes and break their bones. While Israel was the lion in the second oracle, God is now portrayed as the crouching lion or lioness lying down and ready to be roused up in 24 verse 8. Kingship is mentioned again in the third oracle, 24 verse 7. "The king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted." But this here is a human king who will be higher than Agag. Agag is a human king of the Amalekites, which is an old enemy of theirs. In the fourth oracle also, very clearly we see the king coming out of Jacob. So 24 verse 17, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. And it shall crush the forehead of Moab and break all the sons of Sheth." The key things to be noted, to take note, is God's presence is still with them. So remember, for the book of Leviticus, Numbers, the climax, the pinnacle is where God is present with them, and God continues to be with them in the future. Israel is pictured as a lion with God also, who will defeat the enemies. And again, the Abrahamic promise is affirmed. 24 verse 9 of Numbers, it's looking back to Genesis 12 verse 3. "Blessed are those who bless Israel. Cursed are those who curse her." So Israel is still holding on to Abraham's covenant. And also in 24, 5-9, Israel will become like a Garden of Eden. So the goal is for Israel to return back to the Garden of Eden. That's why they were brought out of Egypt. And also in the latter days, in the future, you see a king from Israel who will destroy his old enemies and bring about total dominion. And very importantly, Genesis, it will crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth, and that's the fulfillment of Genesis 3:15 here. So this is what God plans to do with Israel, that he will continue doing. Despite all that has been happening with Israel, all the sin, all the judgment, this is what God promises that he will do to Israel. Now we've got one more chapter, chapter 25, before the first half ends. This is where, right after God blesses Israel, protects Israel, we see Israel plunging into great sin, whoring himself with the daughters of Moab. And this is also caused by Balaam. So we see here also that Balaam actually is not a godly prophet. In the end, he is a pagan prophet, pagan diviner, and he will do what he wants with, as long as there's money. So in this chapter, very interestingly also, is we see Moses not quite obeying God again perfectly. The context, the daughters of Moab went in, whored themselves. So if the nation can't curse Israel, what is the way to get Israel down? It is to get Israel to sin so that God will destroy them, and that's what they did. Verse 3 of 25, Israel yoked himself to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. And the Lord said to Moses, take note of this, take all the chiefs of the people and hang them in the sun before the Lord, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. Now you take a look at verse 5, do you think it's the same command? Moses said to the judges of Israel, each of you kill those of his men who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor. Verse 4 and verse 5 are two different commands. Verse 5 is watering down God's command. And so here again we see questionably what Moses is doing. It's probably because of the practicality of it, like if he killed all the chiefs, then how will he be able to manage everyone? So he reduces it, but that's not great. And also this is also the reason why a plague, most likely because of this, a plague broke out later. But also here we see Phinehas, very important figure, him rising up. So verse 6, and behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family in the sight of Moses and in the sight of the whole congregation of the people of Israel, while they were weeping in the entrance of the tent of meeting. When Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, saw it, he rose and left the congregation and took a spear in his hand and went after the man of Israel into the chamber and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. Thus the plague on the people of Israel was stopped. Nevertheless, those who died by the plague were 24,000. And the Lord said to Moses, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron the priest, has turned back my wrath from the people of Israel, in that he was jealous with my jealousy among them, so that I did not consume the people of Israel in my jealousy. So what we see here is that Eleazar here is being a good priest. In fact, he is being, notice how he atoned for the people. Notice how he turned back God's wrath. He did so by being jealous like God, for God. In that he was jealous with my jealousy among them. So the priest, his job is to represent God to his people, and the way he atoned for God's wrath, the way he subsided God's wrath, was by being God, by killing, by bringing justice into the camp as God would. This is what a true priest should be doing what God would do and representing his people before God. Therefore say, behold, I give to him the covenant of peace, that it shall be to him and his descendants after him the covenant of a perpetual priesthood, because he was jealous for his God and made atonement for the people of Israel. In the end, as much as blood sacrifice is required, but we see here also, eventually the Psalms will quote this or refer back to this, where it says, it is a body, blood of bulls and goats I do not require, but a body. Obedience is what I require. So in the end, we see here a priest looking forward, foreshadowing, being a type of Christ who comes and obeys God, sheds his blood for us to fulfill the true priesthood. So after this, verse 16, God promises, or God calls Israel to continue to harass them, and eventually later on Israel will go in and destroy them. So that's the first half of the book. Coming back to the main diagram, the second half of the book now is different. The tone overall is more positive. In the second half of the book, there is no more death. If you look at it, no more deaths happen, that's a good sign. The first book, first half, just complete death throughout most of the chapters. And the second book starts off with the second census, so another counting of names, but this time not focused on war anymore. It's focused on the next step, which is it's dividing up the land. So if you take note and you compare the two censuses, the first census would focus on the people who would go and fight the war. But the ending of the second census focuses on distributing fair amounts of the land. They're calculating how many people there are so they can work out how much land to give each one based on the size. And when you look at the numbers, you compare the two numbers. The first number for the census was 603,000. The second was 601,000. The difference is only less than 2,000 people. And so this means this is a sign of God's faithfulness. God brought the little ones to the edge of the promised land as he promised in chapter 14. In spite of the fears of the old rebellious generation, they were afraid that God would bring their children to death. Now God says, I will bring your children into the promised land, and that's where they are right now. But you also notice, besides God's faithfulness, also God's faithfulness to judge, there's one particular tribe that experienced dramatic decrease in number, and that's the tribe of Simeon. Okay, that was about 59,000 in the first census, now it's 22,000. And this tribe, one of their members was the one who brought the woman into the camp in chapter 25. And this is most likely why the numbers have dropped so much. God brought judgment on them. The dramatic act of faithlessness and disobedience of Zimri, the Simeonite in Numbers 25, is probably the reason why God judged them. God visits the iniquity of the parents upon their children to the third and fourth generation, Numbers 14:18. The overall effect of the total numbers remaining relatively the same in spite of all the rebellion shows God's as abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression, but by no means clearing the guilty. There are two important passages in Numbers 26 when you read this. First of all, it is the one on the fair distribution of the land. So chapter 26 verse 52. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, among these the land shall be divided for inheritance. So see, the goal is now inheritance. They're looking forward. Verse 54, to a large tribe you shall give a large inheritance. To a small tribe you shall give a small inheritance. Every tribe shall be given its inheritance in proportion to its list, so that it will be fair for everyone. But the land shall be divided by lot. According to the names of the tribes of their fathers they shall inherit. Their inheritance shall be divided according to lot between the larger and the smaller tribes. So there's a very strong emphasis where God's people, there's fairness in God's and all God's people in the land. The formula, all those who are able to go to war, is not repeated anymore in 26. The second text to note also in 26 is 63 and to 65. Verse 63, these were those listed by Moses and Eleazar the priest, who listed the people of Israel in the plains of Moab at the Jordan of Jericho. But among these there was not one of those listed by Moses and Aaron the priests who had listed the people of Israel in the wilderness of Sinai. So the old generation has been completely wiped off here already, now that the second census has come in. Chapter 25 is probably the final phase where God destroys all the old generation. Verse 65, for the Lord had said, they shall die in the wilderness. Not one of them was left except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. So again here we see both God's faithfulness and also God's justice. In the next few accounts, you will notice that 27, 1 to 11, that's Zelophehad's daughter. Now, they will be mentioned again in chapter 36, 1 to 12, and I'll mention them again. But here we have an inclusio that puts it all together. And the story is about Zelophehad's daughter's faith. They're looking forward to the promised land. And it's saying here that this essentially is the most important thing for the new generation. This is what they are the example of what a true new generation Israelite should be, looking forward to the promised land, obeying God, and us approaching God for help. In chapter 27, 12 to 23, we see a change in leadership, and so this is where we see Moses passing on the mantle to Joshua. And Moses again reminded that he can't enter the promised land because he rebelled against God, verse 14. And so Moses, verse 16, again, this proves Moses' meekness. He asked the Lord, let the Lord, the God of spirits of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation. So Moses isn't the kind of person who is bitter about it. Since I'm not going to go, might as well let them die. But he actually cares for God. He actually cares for Israel still. And he asked for God to send another leader. And God does, it's Joshua. But Joshua will be lesser than Moses, verse 18. Take Joshua the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hand on him. Make him stand before Eleazar the priest and all the congregation, and you shall commission him in their sight. You shall invest him with some of your authority. So it's not all of Moses' authority, and it will say later in Deuteronomy that Moses is the one and only prophet there is. And we're looking forward to the prophet like Moses, who is ultimately Jesus. So Moses here is unique. We've seen that also in Numbers. So invest some of your authority on Joshua and all the congregation of the people, Israel, so that they may obey. And so God and Moses did this, and they passed it over. And the next part, chapter 28, we see a list of laws and rules again. Now this, you can take a look at this diagram, this table. And again, what you have here is the rules for sacrifices, for important sacrifices once they reach the land. So you can see the amount of lambs, rams, and bulls required, and the only way someone can sustain that is if they have abundance. So again, this is a law that's looking forward to them being in the promised land. A couple of significance for this this laws. So number one, it shows the importance of a sacrificial system in Israel. Again, sacrificial system is important. We can look back to Leviticus, what they mean. But the burnt offering is, again, whilst it's having atonement, it does atonement, but it's also a reminder that the Israelites are to live lives as living sacrifices and pleasing sacrifices to God. That's why it's supposed to be a sweet aroma to God. Second, these sacrifices also show a strong assurance to Joshua that the nation will indeed inherit the land and become a prosperous agricultural community. And finally, also, this list underlines the importance of a sabbatical principle. If you notice, if you take a look at that list carefully, every seventh day is a Sabbath and marked by a doubling of the daily sacrifice. Every time there's a seventh month, there will also be a huge number of extra sacrifices. Looking forward, therefore, to that final rest, to that Sabbath rest, is a continual reminder for them. They're entering the promised land. What they're aiming towards is that final rest. And in chapter 31 to 33, finally we have some narrative again. And here we have two potential crises that might destroy Israel again. The first one is 31, and then the one we're looking at is verse 13 to 24. So here we know that Moses asks Israelites to go and defeat and to destroy the Moabite women because of what they did to them. But what they did not do was they did not destroy all the women. In fact, they left them alive. So Moses, Eleazar the priest, and all the chiefs of the congregation went to meet them outside, and Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of the thousands and the commanders of hundreds who had come to them from service in the war. Moses said to them, "Have you let all the women live?" And this is an important thing because they were destroyed. They were judged by God because of women, because they committed sexual immorality. And here, the new generation, they went in, conquered, and they let the women live. What does that mean? Are they making the same mistake, committing the same sin as their forefathers? So this is a red alert term. Have they really changed? Or are they the same? Will they be destroyed again before they enter the promised land? Verse 16, behold, these on Balaam's advice, so here it is Balaam who did it, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor. And so the plague came among the congregation of the Lord. Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man by lying with him. But all the young girls you have not known, who have not known men by lying with him, keep alive for yourself. And so here a compromise is reached. The new generation has not been all out rebellious. This is definitely a problem, but you can see that they obeyed. And so that's why in the graph, in the structural graph, there's a going down but going back up a little bit because they obeyed, but it was not the same as what they were before. The second incident, well, after this, of course, again you see grace. The amount of plunder they got in verse 32 onwards shows God's gracious blessings. These are 675,000 sheep and all that. That's amazing blessing. And very importantly, in verse 49 of chapter 31, you see God's faithfulness and protection. Your servants have counted the men of war who are under our command, and there is not a man missing from us. This is what would have happened if the old generation obeyed. They were so afraid of entering the promised land. They were so afraid of the people there. They were so distrusting of God's promise, of God's power. Well, you see it here. If you trust God, none of your men will perish. This is a sign of, this is a reversal or a show of what would have happened, and this is to some extent a positive sign so far, although not without the negatives. The next incident is chapter 32, verse 1 onwards. So this is one of the most, this is a heart attack moment, where the people of Reuben and Gad had a very great number of livestock, and they didn't want to go to the promised land. They wanted to stay. So they gathered up the elders, and verse 5, they said, if we have found favor in your sight, let this land be given to your servant for possession. Do not take us across the Jordan. Now that's a problem. When you hear that, what do you think about? You immediately recall the spies who told everyone not to go across to the Jordan. So verse 6, Moses said to the people of Gad and to the people of Reuben, shall your brothers go to war while you sit here? While you discourage the heart of the people of Israel from going over into the land that the Lord has given them. And your fathers did this. So they're equating them with the fathers when I sent them to Kadesh Barnea to see the land. For when they went up to the valley of Eshcol and saw the land, they discouraged the heart of the people of Israel from going into the land the Lord had given them. And the Lord's anger was kindled on that day, and he swore, surely none of the men who came up out of Egypt from 20 years old and upwards shall see the land that I swore to give to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, because they have not wholly followed me. None except Caleb and Joshua. So verse 13, and the Lord's anger was kindled against Israel, and he made them wander in 40 days. Verse 14, and behold, you have risen in your father's place, a brood of sinful men, to increase still more the fierce anger of the Lord against Israel. For if you turn away from following him, he will abandon them in the wilderness, and you will destroy all these people. So here, again, the new generation, they're not very promising. They show signs of the old generation. But of course, things don't get so bad. This is grace again. The only way that they can enter the promised land in the end is God's faithfulness. So here God provides a solution. God lets them have the land if they promise to go all the way. So they negotiate. They say they'll go into the land to fight with them. They'll leave their kids, they'll build the houses, they'll leave their kids here and then go and fight and then come back once everything's done. And they will not turn back until the war is fought, is won. And so for that alone, God said, okay. But already here you can see the problem. They don't want to enter the promised land. In chapter 34, which is the next chapter, here's a map for you. You can see that in the green area is the area for the promised land. The gray area is, or at least I see it as gray, is the land that these tribes will occupy, but they are not the promised land, Reuben and Gad. So what we see here is a less than ideal picture of Israel entering the land. even before they enter the land. But the promised land is drawn out very beautifully, and it's a very big land. The problem though is, as you read Deuteronomy and Joshua, they never fully occupy it all, and that also is a problem. Chapter 33 recounts the whole story. It recounts the whole journey. Most of us, when we read chapter 33, take a look at it, it's just lots of places names. What you should do besides looking at the places names, but look for the sentences that don't have the places name, and you will see them mentioning God's victory as an encouragement. And also at the end of chapter 33, they warn them that they need to devote the cities in a promised land to complete destruction. The reason for that is because if they leave anyone behind, they will lead them astray. Israel's holiness is important. They need to be utterly devoted to God in the land. In the future, when they fight wars, once they occupy the land, they can show more mercy to outsiders, but in the land they must be completely devoted to God. And so if they don't, they will be kicked out of the land, which they eventually did. Now, 34 to 35 are some more laws as promised again. So again, it's looking forward to the promised land. So it gives the Levitical cities and also the cities of refuge. What's important here is that the Levites, if you remember, who are in charge of guarding the holiness of God, they will be distributed throughout the land of Israel. And the way they are spread around is that they will be spread sporadically. Because number one, the Levites, they don't have allotment of land, so they'll be spread out. But also the way they are spread out is to make sure that there are Levites at every place, and God's holiness is being spread out. So verse 35, chapter 35, verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab at the Jordan at Jericho, saying, command the people of Israel to give to the Levites some of the inheritance of their possession as cities for them to dwell in. And you shall give the Levites pasture lands around the cities. The cities shall be theirs to dwell in, and the pasture land shall be for their cattle and for their livestock and for their beasts. Can you see? Cities will be given to them to dwell in, and they'll be spread across. And there will also be cities of refuge. The cities of refuge are for those who accidentally kill someone, and they can run to these places to find refuge. The concern for all this is to preserve the holiness and the purity of the land. Bloodshed pollutes the land, and so they want to minimize as much killing as possible. So if people accidentally kill someone, they can run to these cities so that less blood can be shed. But if murder is intentional, they can't run. People can still go up to the cities of refuge and demand that they come back. And also what's interesting in chapter 35 and 25, chapter 35, 25, is that when the priest dies, they act as a substitute propitiation for the blood shed by any unintentional killer. So when the high priest dies, those who killed unintentionally, they can go back free. And I think that's foreshadowing Christ, his death for sinners. And finally, in Numbers 36, 1 to 12, here we come back to Zelophehad's daughter. So the first time they came out was because they had no male in the group, and they were asking for God to allow them to inherit the land. And God allows it because what's more important is equality for the land, for the tribes. But the second time they come up here, again, they come up in faith, they come up hoping in the promise. And so this is ideally the right kind of Israelite who will be hoping in God, hoping in the promised land, seeking for God. So here the problem is, if they marry, the problem is that their land will be given over to the male side. What are they to do? So God tells them to marry within the tribe and sets a law for this so that the inheritance can be kept in the land. The book of Numbers therefore ends on a hopeful tone. It's not completely positive. It's quite negative on the people, as we've seen. First half, second half. Second half is scary. Second half, it seems like they're the same. But overall, there's faith in God that He will fulfill His promise. The book ends with verse 16 with the term Jericho. The very last word in the Hebrew and English Bible is the word Jericho, helping them to look forward to that first stage of the conquest. So what is the book of Numbers all about? Well, at the very least, it's about showing you Israel's utter sinfulness. It shows you humanity's inability to obey God's laws. It shows you our total depravity. But at the same time, it asks you to look towards God, to trust Him, to cling on to Him, to have faith in Him, that He will fulfill His promise and save us. This is the same kind of message that you will see in Deuteronomy. It is a very realistic view of humanity. It doesn't say humanity will be great. He says humanity will be sinful. But God will be great. Part of God's salvation plan is that He will come. He will save us. This is how God will establish His kingdom, through His Son, not through us. Through Him defeating His enemies, defeating sin, and saving us. The message of Numbers then is clear. Humanity cannot be trusted. Humanity is sinful. Humanity cannot obey the law. Only God can be trusted because He does not change His mind. What He has promised, He will fulfill. In the New Testament, we see that all the promises are fulfilled in Christ. Christ has come, Christ has brought His people into the land, and we are His people if we trust Him. We are His house. We are God's house if we trust in Jesus. Jesus has come to save us, to die for us, to be our Passover lamb, to give us a new spirit, a new heart, so that we can obey Him. Christ Himself, according to Hebrews, has gone to the final rest. He is our champion. He's our forerunner. He's been there. He is there. And He now helps us there. So let us watch out lest we forsake this great message, Hebrews 2. Lest we drift off. Let us hold tightly to this message of salvation that we have heard, this great message, and let us keep running the race. Hebrews 3, verse 7 is written for us. Therefore, as the Holy Spirit says, today if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts. And today you have heard His voice. You have heard His voice from the Scriptures. Do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. Don't be like the Israelites who hear God's word but reject it. On a day of testing in the wilderness, where your fathers put me to the test and saw my works for 40 years. You've seen now, through the Scriptures, Jesus' works. Do not harden your hearts. Be warned, be comforted. Put your trust in Jesus. Verse 10, therefore I was provoked with that generation and said, they always go astray in their hearts. They have not known my ways. As I saw in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. We are, as Christians, living in the wilderness right now. We have been saved. We are post-Sinai, in the modern sense. We are post-Christ's death and resurrection. But we are not yet at the promised land. We are not yet at the final rest. And so it remains for us still to enter that final rest, and we must strive hard. We have the word, we have heard the word. None of you should be grumbling. None of you should leave Christianity. You've heard the message, you've seen God's work, you've seen judgment. Hold on to Christ's salvation. Verse 13, but exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today. As long as it is not yet final rest, as long as it is today, keep encouraging one another, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. You saw how for Israelites, they had lots of excuses, they have lots of grumblings. and very sinful. They have God's word, they have God's presence, and yet they complain. Life is too hard. I want to turn back. My old Christian life is much easier. This Christianity, there's too much work, too much complaint. So and so is asking me to do too much, I just need a break. Take care and watch out for a rebellious and sinful heart. Watch out for the deceitfulness of sin. For we have come to share in Christ. You already have Christ, if we hold on to our original confidence firm to the end. As it is said, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. Keep in mind that those who harden their hearts died. And today too, if you harden your hearts continually against God, you will be judged. Hebrews 3 and 4 talks about it, Hebrews 6 talks about it, Hebrews 10 talks about it, 1 Corinthians 10 has the same warning. If you continue to test God, test the Spirit, grumble, being a Christian, wanting your own life, falling away, there will be no more forgiveness. Chapter 4 verse 1, therefore while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear. Fear in Christianity is a good thing. There's a healthy fear, a fear of God, an acknowledgement that you are not Lord, you are not boss. Let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For the good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter the rest, as he said, as I saw in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Although his works were finished from the foundation of the world, for he has somewhere spoken on the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage he said, they have not entered my rest. Since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience. Again he points a certain day today, saying through David so long afterward in the words already quoted, today if you hear his voice, hear and obey, do not harden your hearts. Verse 11, let us therefore strive to enter that rest. Striving will involve effort. But the striving is part of this God's discipline to make you stronger to enter the land, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. Verse 12, for the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and spirit, of joints and marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. God knows what is in our hearts, and he will judge us on that final day. No creature is hidden from his sight, but are all exposed and naked to his eyes, to whom we must give an account. So brothers and sisters, I hope you've been encouraged by the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers is a very realistic book. It tells us very clearly our failures, our weaknesses, but it also tells us God's faithfulness. And we have seen as Christians God's faithfulness through Christ's death and resurrection. You have the Spirit that the Father's longed for. You have Christ that Father's longed for. Our journey to the end is shorter than what they had. We're heading there. Don't give up. Keep holding on to Christ, encouraging one another through love and good deeds to reach there. Let me pray. Dear God, we thank you for the book of Numbers. We thank you for all these examples that you've written down, as 1 Corinthians 10:6 says. It's for our benefit, so that we will learn from all the rebellion and sin and the judgment they have. We'll be warned to not follow their footsteps. We'll be warned to listen to your word, to not grumble, but to be obedient to your word. We thank you for the grace that you've shown to us, just as you've shown them. You are now with us through Christ. You've now saved us through Christ. You've now given us your Spirit so that we may live to you. We pray that we will continue to be consistent as a Christian. We will continue to listen to your voice. We will not feel tired. And if we do, you will energize us, you send people to encourage us, and that we can encourage one another to strive together to reach that final rest to see you. In the name of Jesus we pray.